We are entrusting the day and the endeavor to the Lord. Let's go. Welcome to my channel where I visit many good books but live in the Bible. My name is Sarah Christine, and today I would like to talk about none other than Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. I picked this up for a class on imagining the apocalypse, having never heard of Station 11 before, which surprising because apparently this book was a bit of a deal when it was published in 2014, and then it became an even bigger deal in 2020 when the world got walloped by COVID because Station 11 is about a modern day global pandemic. So this book was low-key prophetic. Now, as a reading experience, Station 11 wasn't exactly my cup of tea because it required a little too much suspension of disbelief, and not the pandemic bit. Like, I don't need to imagine that. I #lived it. No, what required me suspending my disbelief was the way the novel portrays human beings, because it was just too saccharine, too sweet. Particularly after reading The Road and Parable of the Sower, where people are getting assaulted and eaten left, right, and center, which frankly coheres a lot more with what I expect of human behavior. Because in Station 11, the characters that we spend the most amount of time with are very kumbaya. They're like, let us perform Shakespeare as we travel around Lake Michigan, and let us set up museums to our shared past in abandoned airports. And I was just like, listen, I worked at a Midwestern Walmart during COVID. And this is not an accurate depiction of how human beings behave in stressful and or lawless situations. And I was not the only one who thought that. There were two other students in my class who said that Station 11's portrayal of human beings was what they had been yearning for the entire semester, because they want to believe that humanity would pull together a la Michael Jackson's We Are the World if poop hit the fan. But both of them were like, we hated this. One of them said that the word they could not get out of their head was corny.
Corny?
Now, having said all that, I'm still really glad that I read Station 11, because while I could not buy into the broader narrative, I did agree with the Traveling Symphony's reason for being, which is, quote, because survival is insufficient, which, fun fact, is a Star Trek Voyager reference. Love that. Because I do think art is so important. In fact, I recently bought a friend of mine who is an artist at the Santa Fe Opera House, amazing, a little fridge magnet which says, Earth without art is just eh. I don't disagree with that, so I can totally get behind having a Shakespeare company and a traveling symphony post-apocalypse. That said, did I agree with Station 11's apparent contention that art will redeem the human condition? No. And here's the thing. The fact that art in no way guarantees human flourishing was clear, even within the confines of Station 11 itself, which made me wonder, what are you up to, Emily St. John Mandel? Is it that you know art really isn't all that and intentionally sought to undermine your trooper's raison d'etre? Or is it that reality intruded on the story you wanted to tell? I couldn't tell, but I'm genuinely curious to know. And comment below if you've ever read something where you felt the author's intent and the message they left were maybe not on the same page. Pun intended. Anywho, before I get into the moments in Station 11 where I felt the art will redeem this message gets called into question, I want to provide some additional orientation. As I've already said, Station 11 begins with a global pandemic, which wipes out the vast majority of the human population. But that's really just the backdrop. We get the day of the outbreak and a little bit more than that, but then the book jumps 20 years ahead. Side note, I don't tend to like when books do that, but the sentence that marked the time jump transition was actually really excellent. This is page 35. 20 years after the end of air travel, the caravans of the Traveling Symphony moved slowly under a white, hot sky. That's a good line. From then on, we're dealing with different timelines and storylines as Station 11 jumps between past and present and also jumps between different characters' heads. But all of the characters have one person in common, and it's the first person that we see dead. That person is Arthur Leander, an actor who did not die of the virus. He actually died on stage during a production of King Lear because he had a heart attack during the play. While Arthur may not be patient zero, all roads in Station 11 kind of do lead back to him, which is a little bit unfortunate because Arthur is kind of a piece of human excrement. Indeed, Arthur is the first proof that experiencing art, whether as the creator or the receiver, in no way guarantees either human goodness or human flourishing. Because Arthur might be, or frankly, might have been a big deal on screen, but he has absolutely tanked his relationships with his friends and family. In fact, when he dies, the only person to call is his lawyer. This is page 14. Has anyone been informed? Who do we call? I should call his lawyer, the producer said. This solution was inarguable, but so depressing that the group drank for several minutes in silence before anyone could bring themselves to speak. His lawyer, the bartender said finally. Christ, what a thing. You die and they call your lawyer. Who else is there? Goneril asked. His agent, the 7-year-old, the ex-wives, Tanya? I know, the bartender said. It's just a hell of a thing. Now, I know correlation is not causation, but I certainly think there is a link between Arthur's acting and his relationships tanking. Because as an actor, Arthur's job is to be and express art in the flesh. He both creates and conveys artistic experiences in order to move audiences, which means his expertise is not so much in human connection, it's in scene setting and emotional manipulation. And that habituation, that professional deformation, once it becomes an automatic switch, it gets real hard for Arthur to flip. We see this when Arthur meets up with his oldest friend and cannot turn off the artifice. This is page 110. A year before the Georgia flu, Arthur and Clark met for dinner in London. When Clark went in, Arthur was waiting, caught under a beam of track lighting in a booth at the back. There had been a time when Arthur would never have faced the dining room of a restaurant, long periods when the only way to eat a meal in peace was to sit with his back to the room and hope no one would recognize his hunched shoulders and expensive haircut from behind. But now, Clark realized, Arthur wanted to be seen. I've been indecently lucky, Arthur said later that night on his 4th martini. It was a line he'd been using a great deal lately. Clark wouldn't have been bothered by it if he hadn't seen Arthur use it in Entertainment Weekly a month or two earlier. The restaurant was one of those large, underlit places that seemed to recede into shadow at the periphery, and in the murky middle distance, Clark saw a pinpoint of green light that meant someone was recording Arthur on a cell phone. Clark felt increasingly stiff. He was aware of the whispers that had sprung up, the glances from other tables. Arthur was talking about an endorsement deal of some kind, men's watches, his gestures loose. He was telling an animated story about his meeting with the watch executives, some kind of humorous misunderstanding in the boardroom. He was performing. Clark had thought he was meeting his oldest friend for dinner, but Arthur wasn't having dinner with a friend, Clark realized, so much as having dinner with an audience. He felt sick with disgust. When he left a short time later, he found himself wandering, even though by now he'd oriented himself and knew how to get back to the tube station. Cold rain, the sidewalk shining, the shh of car tires on the wet street, thinking about the terrible gulf of years between 18 and 50. Yep, even with his oldest friend, Arthur cannot turn off the artifice. And when he meets up with one of his ex-wives, because there are 3 of these ladies, to give her a heads up about a book of his private letters that are being published by a former friend where her name may or may not make an appearance, his ex Miranda clocks the same tendency. Arthur can't stop acting. This is page 211. It must be infuriating having your letters sold. I was angry at first. I'm still angry. But the truth is, I think I deserved everything I got. He carried 2 mugs of green tea to the coffee table, where they left rings of steam on the glass. Why do you think you deserved it? I treated Victoria like a diary. He lifted his mug, blew on the surface of his tea, and returned the mug very deliberately to the table. There was a studied quality to the movement, and Miranda had an odd impression that he was performing a scene. She wrote to me at first, in the very beginning, maybe 2 letters and 3 postcards back when I first started writing to her from Toronto. Then a couple of quick notes telling me about changes in address with a cursory note at the beginning. You know, hi, sorry for not writing more, I've been busy, here's my new address. So all the times I saw you writing her, Miranda said, she never wrote back. She was surprised by how sad this made her. Right. I used her as a repository for my thoughts. I think I stopped thinking of her as a human being reading a letter. He looked up, and here a pause, in which Miranda could almost see the script. Arthur looks up. Beat. Was he acting? She couldn't tell. The truth is, I think I actually forgot that she was real. Did this happen to all actors, this blurring of borders between performance and life? The man playing the part of the aging actor sipped his tea, and in that moment, acting or not, it seemed to her that he was deeply unhappy. "It sounds like you've had a difficult year," she said. "I'm sorry." Clearly, Arthur, for all his artistry, is not a particularly good human being. He cannot quit it with the artifice, and he superimposes his acting onto all his relationships. So he's one example of how art from the creation end can be far from beneficial or redemptive. But his ex Miranda, who he had tea with, is another example of how creating art does not necessarily lead to human flourishing. We see this on page 94 when Arthur and Miranda were still married and he was busy making movies. Miranda was pouring herself into the creation of a graphic novel titled Station 11, about a man who lives on a defunct planetary space station. This is at a dinner party where Arthur's Hollywood friends are sort of wondering, what does his little woman do? And they ask, "How's your work going?" "It's going very well, thank you." Miranda spends most of her time working on the Station 11 project. She knows from the gossip blogs that people here see her as an eccentric, the actor's wife who inks mysterious cartoons that no one's ever laid eyes on. "My wife's very private about her work," Arthur says in interviews, "and who doesn't drive and likes to go for long walks in a town where nobody walks anywhere, and who has no friends except a Pomeranian. Although, does anyone really know this last part? She hopes not. Her friendlessness is never mentioned in gossip blogs, which she appreciates. She hopes she isn't as awkward to other people as she feels to herself." Miranda never fits in LA, which very much is Arthur's domain, but her friendlessness does not change after she and Arthur split and she says, "See you never" to Los Angeles. We see that on page 107. In 4 months, Miranda will be back in Toronto, divorced at 27, working on a commerce degree, spending her alimony on expensive clothing and consultations with stylists because she's come to understand that clothes are armor. She will call Leon Prevant to ask about employment, and a week later she'll be back at Neptune Logistics, in a more interesting job now, working under Leon in client relations, rising rapidly through the company until she comes to a point after 4 or 5 years when she travels almost constantly between a dozen countries and lives mostly out of a carry-on suitcase, a time when she lives a life that feels like freedom and sleeps with her downstairs neighbor occasionally but refuses to date anyone, whispers, "I repent nothing" into the mirrors of 100 hotel rooms from London to Singapore, and in the morning puts on the clothes that make her invincible. A life where the moments of emptiness and disappointment are minimal, where by her mid-30s she feels competent and at last more or less at ease in the world, studying foreign languages in first-class lounges and traveling in comfortable seats across oceans, meeting with clients and living her job, breathing her job until she isn't sure where she stops and her job begins. Almost always loves her life, but is often lonely. Draws the stories of Station 11 in hotel rooms at night. For Miranda, Station 11 becomes the heart of her life, which is no surprise because we're told in Matthew 6:21 that where our treasure is, there our hearts will be also. And as Miranda invests her time, her talents, her resources into Station 11, her heart follows the work of her hands. And though she eventually makes 2 volumes of Station 11, Miranda never really makes a meaningful human connection. Actually, Miranda reminded me a fair bit of Basil from The Picture of Dorian Gray. I did a review of this, I will link it below, because Miranda, like Basil, is so intent on creating that she never really gets around to participating. Miranda acknowledges as much on page 95 when she is asked whether she would ever publish Station 11, and she says, "It's the work itself that's important to me." Miranda is aware of how pretentious this sounds, but is it still pretentious if it's true? Not whether I publish it or not. I think that's so great, Elizabeth says. It's like the point is that it exists in the world, right? What's the point of doing all that work, Tesh asks, if no one sees it? It makes me happy. It's peaceful spending hours working on it. It doesn't really matter to me if anyone else sees it. From that, we can see that where Arthur's art has led him to be artificial, Miranda's has led her to be artisanal and antisocial. None of those tendencies are ideal, and from Arthur and Miranda, we can see that creating art does not guarantee human flourishing. But art's creation isn't the only end of the equation. We have to look at how art is received too, and just like on the creation end, there are reception issues. In Station 11, we see those issues in two figures, the archer and the prophet. We meet both of these men in the present day when the Traveling Symphony does a performance in a town that has fallen into the grip of a cult leader who calls himself the prophet. He's doing all the standard cult leader things, having multiple wives, not letting anyone leave his group alive, and espousing his interpretation of the virus, which incidentally casts him and his people as exclusively righteous.
We're the good guys.
Unwilling to drink the Kool-Aid, the members of the Traveling Symphony make a hasty and clandestine exit from the town, only to shortly thereafter find out that one of the prophet's soon-to-be child brides has stowed away with them because, surprise, surprise, she does not want to marry the prophet. Now, the Traveling Symphony troopers cannot, in good conscience, take the girl back, but because they don't, the cult comes after them and they start picking the troopers off one by one until there are only 2 members of the Traveling Symphony left. They are a woman named Kirsten and her friend August, and by the end of Station 11, they have managed to find a group of the prophet's men who are holding one of their fellow troopers, a man named Saeed, hostage. The 2 groups go at it with bows and arrows, and miraculously, Kirsten and August get the better of the exchange, and they're able to neutralize the prophet's men and save their friend, except Saeed has some bad news for them. This is page 285. "The prophet's behind us with the dog," Saeed whispered. "He's got 2 men with him. We split up to take different roads about a half-mile back." Kirsten helped him to his feet. "The archer's still alive," August said. The archer, one of the prophet's men, was lying on his back. His eyes followed Kirsten, but he made no other movement. She knelt beside him. He'd been in the audience when they performed A Midsummer's Night's Dream at St. Deborah by the water, applauding in the front row at the end of the performance, smiling, his eyes wet in the candlelight. I'll be so honest, it took Station 11 285 pages to get me to lock in, but it was this scene, this moment with the archer, that ultimately made me so glad I read this. Because this little paragraph right here floodlighted the fact that the Traveling Symphony's performance of A Midsummer's Night's Dream, that is, their art, had moved but not improved this man. And ever since I read it, it has lived rent-free in my head that art can move us without ever improving us. Because on the receiving end of the Traveling Symphony's art, the archer had wet eyes, but an unchanged heart. His heart, like his arrows, remained barbed. And I don't think that's a unique experience. I think there's plenty of art that can move us without ever improving us. Much as creatives, and I would count myself among them, would be reluctant to admit it, art on its own is actually pretty impotent. Like, it may make us cry, but it cannot override our insides, which are, from my perspective, twisted, sick, and wicked. Like Jeremiah 17:9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can fathom it?" Art is not a solution to our twisted, sick wickedness. And as a proof, I give you the prophet, a man who, convinced he is an emissary of light, is actually an engine of darkness, who has taken the art he has received, like the Book of Revelation and Miranda's graphic novel, Station 11, and has twisted them into a worldview that mythologizes and justifies the sick and wicked things that he wants to do. And in the prophet doing that, we see yet another art reception issue. Not only is art impotent, able to move but not improve, it is also subject to twisting and abuse by people who want to take the moving power of art and put it to dark use. Now, having talked about how art can make us artificial, artisanal, and antisocial, moved but not improved, and help us to justify and mythologize the twisted, sick, and wicked things we want to do, you may reasonably assume that I look at art with a rather dim view. But it would not be true. Remember, Earth without art is just In fact, I'm a huge fan of art, but I think it really matters how art starts. And from my point of view, I think God must be a part. Because only when He precedes art do you get heart. And I don't know about you, but I want God's heart, God's love to be in all I do. Because God's love isn't artificial, it's true. And God's love isn't artisanal and antisocial, it's universal and poured out for me and for you. In fact, there's a worship song called So Will I with lyrics that are very relevant to this, where it says, God of salvation, you chase down my heart through all of my failures and pride. On a hill you created, the light of the world, abandoned in darkness to die. And as you speak, 100 billion failures disappear, where you lost your life so I could find it here. If you left the grave behind you, so will I. I can see your heart in everything you've done, every part designed in a work of art called love. And I can tell you from personal experience that when we receive that work of art, that love, we are not only moved, we are infinitely improved because Jesus, God's word made flesh, love incarnate, sanctifies us, like John 17:17 says, by His truth. And when we truly have Jesus, we will not get things twisted because John 7:17 says that if anyone desires to do God's will, they will know of the teaching, whether it is from God or from man. So none of our sick, twisted, wicked little thoughts are going to overcome what God has said. So if you, like me, enjoy creating and or receiving art, my first exhortation to you is that you would receive and believe in the creator, the great artist of everything that is, and then that you would get after it and imitate him. Because earth without art is just but only when he precedes art do we get heart. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that this was edifying, encouraging, and entertaining, and I hope you will continue to join me as I visit many good books, but live in the Bible. Speaking of viruses, as I was reading this, the hantavirus outbreak was coming out on the news, and I immediately had to call up my mama and be like, you, stop with your one-woman war on rodents.
Mom! Okay, don't need to videotape.
Because we're not doing pandemic round 2. Not for me, not for you.